Hi friends, and welcome to today's Tuesday travel vlog, where every Tuesday I post a new video about the fun things that I've done and the cool places that I've been as I travel cross country in my RV. Today's travel vlog comes to you from the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. First question, why is there a Titanic museum in Pigeon Forge? Well, Pigeon Forge in general is kind of like a theme park area as well. You've got all sorts of different wonderful buildings and different themes. So it's just here to be a museum and to bring in tourists. I can't seem to find any other reason as to what the Titanic has to do with Pigeon Forge, except for it to just be a museum. Let's start with the story of the Titanic itself, in case you are not familiar with the largest disaster in history, in maritime history. The Titanic was built to be the largest ship ever. It was built in Belfast, Ireland. It was boasted to be unsinkable. That is because of the watertight bulkheads. They had these doors that could come down that should there be a head-on collision, they could close down those doors there. Should there be on the side, such as somebody ramming you there, they could close those doors down there. But it was only built to stay afloat with 4 of those compartments. Nobody thought 6 would ever be breached, as on that fateful night. So let's travel with the story. That journey starts on April 10th in Southampton, England. After it left Southampton, it then travels down to France, and then up to Ireland, and across the Atlantic to New York, which of course it doesn't make it. The Titanic struck an iceberg on April 14th at 11:40 p.m. The question is, right, why? How did they strike this iceberg? Why did they not see it? On this particular season, it was a particularly warmer season, so a lot of the ice flows from Newfoundland and north had come a little bit further down into the shipping lane. Normally they would stay further north, but because they came down a little bit further, the ships themselves had to be extra careful about the icebergs. The particular night, it was a very starry, calm night. So because the water wasn't moving, you couldn't see the water hit the base of the iceberg. It was just flat glass. So unfortunately, they didn't see it until they got there. The iceberg struck along the side of the ship, again, puncturing those 6 watertight compartments. Unfortunately, there were not enough lifeboats for everybody. The reasoning behind this was kind of twofold. There really were no laws at that time dictating, there were no governmental laws dictating what the number of lifeboats should be. It was left up to each individual ship and each individual company that owned the ship. And then particularly for the Titanic, they're like, well, we're unsinkable, we're not going to need them, and it takes up too much deck space. So if I have a lifeboat sitting on my deck, my people can't enjoy their time on a ship they're not going to survive anyways. So not enough lifeboats, and it was women and children first, and it was first-class passengers as well. On some lifeboats, it was women and children only. There were no men to be found on these lifeboats unless they were acting in a seafaring capacity, such as rowing or steering the boats. So first-class passengers had the pick of the litter when it came to lifeboats, and most of the men of the ship have not survived. It is mostly women, and the largest parish would be those in steerage or third class that were below decks. Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on the following day. It took about another 4 hours for the Carpathia, who did pick up their signal and said, we need to go, the Carpathia to get there and to rescue anybody in a lifeboat or anybody who may have survived the icy waters. So thousands of people perished. Thousands of pieces of luggage and mail and personal items sank to the bottom of the Atlantic, just south of Newfoundland. So the museum. First of all, the museum is extremely busy. They do require you to book your tickets ahead of time. Don't expect to just walk up to the door and get right in. So definitely book at least the day before, if not that morning, so you know when to get there and you can go in. They do control the number of people that go in at a time. So when you do get there, you are given a boarding pass. This is the story of the person who was really on the Titanic. It's now your story. That's who you are, and you get to learn a little bit about their life. And when you get to the end, as to whether or not they survived. So here's my person. Mine is Miriam Cantor. She was 24 and headed towards Bronx, New York. She was from Russia, and she was traveling with her husband. So she wanted to immigrate to America to learn English, study medicine, and practice dentistry. She was a second-class passenger. This is my boarding pass. On the very first floor of the museum, there was no photography allowed, so I wasn't able to take a lot of pictures to show you about that. But this is where it starts to talk about the crew, the building of the ship, why it was being built in Belfast, how it was built. It goes through the life of many different types of people on board, talks about the kosher kitchen for the Jewish families, who my person, Miriam, was part of the Jewish experience. It is a self-guided tour with an audio option, so as you stop at the different areas, you just press on the buttons and you get to listen to it, but you can take your time, you can move through as you like. Eventually you get to the grand staircase. Once you get up to the second floor, photography is allowed. So the grand staircase, of course, was on the Titanic, and it was quite grand. There is no doubt about it. So you get to walk up that. The first exhibit that you get to when you're up there, it talks about the band that was playing on the Titanic, and the story is that the band played during the sinking. They did not abandon their posts. They continued to play and were lost at sea, many of them never to be recovered again. Talks about the children that were on board, and including has lots of messages from the last known female survivor, Ava Hart, who passed in 2005. One of the best exhibits was his photo gallery of Father Brown. Father Brown actually disembarked in Ireland from the ship. He did not continue to New York. His collection is the only known photos to really still be of what life was like on those first couple of days in the Titanic, because of course everything else was lost at sea. His photos weren't found until after he passed in 1960. They were found in a steamer trunk that he had stored basically in the attic at the Abbey where he was at. But in that, what life looked like, walking on board, the luggage, the mail. So it was a very amazing gallery, just full of true images and the only known images to still be there. As you walk your way from first class, second class, and into third class and see what the cabins may have been like, you then are welcomed onto the bridge. The bridge is in a replica of what the bridge would have been like on the Titanic, including the captain's wheel as well as the telegraph bells. From there, you exit out onto the deck of the ship. It's dark, like it would have been at night. You can smell the air. You can smell the iceberg, you can smell the Atlantic, and they even have the water that you can touch to feel how cold it was. And you are literally standing outside of the bridge on the Titanic. That was pretty cool. There are lots of fun trivia throughout that you can test your knowledge. You can sit on a lifeboat and listen to more stories. As the Titanic was sinking bow first, it's always been noted about how people were holding on to the railing so that they wouldn't fall into the water. You can walk those decks as it increasingly went steeper and steeper to know how hard it was to hold on. The museum also has the largest Titanic made of Legos. It took him 11 months to create, 56,000 Legos, and 120 tubes of crazy glue. As you move through the museum, you then get to the memorial wall, which breaks down the first, second, and third passengers, as well as the crew, those who survived and those who did not. It is at this wall that you can learn the fate of your boarding pass. So I did look up Miriam Cantor. Miriam did survive the Titanic disaster. However, her husband did not. Although Miriam has gone on to live, her death date is unknown, as well as much more about her history as to what happened after she got off the Titanic. Of course, the museum does finish with the finding of the Titanic, talks a little bit about the equipment used and how they found it, including photos of what it looks like today. I consider myself a bit of aficionado when it comes to the Titanic. I've read the books. Yes, of course, I saw the movie. Um, that aside, piece of fiction that it is, it does have a lot of historical things in it. And I've been fascinated with how this actually came about. It was the pride and the ego of the upperclassmen. It was the um, desire for riches and luxuries. It was the American capitalism that brought thousands of people to their death. So I found this museum to be quite fascinating, knowing as much as I do about the story and as much as my personal life, how I've researched it and I've read it. This museum does quite a good job. There is a lot there. It really does focus on the people, letters that they have here that were written. There are lots of different artifacts that are on display. It talks about life of that time. It talks about obviously the captain. There's plenty about Captain Smith. This was his last voyage. He was to retire after this. Unfortunately, he did go down with his ship. The museum itself is shaped like the Titanic. It's at third scale, so it's not as big, but you certainly can't miss it. Still don't know why it's in Pigeon Forge, except for the fact that the owner decided to build one here. But a very good museum, very tastefully done. I highly recommend it if you happen to be in this area. So I'm on my way home from the museum, which I've been thinking about, and the museum weighs heavily on the human experience, the people, the crew, what was life was like on the Titanic, what was like life was like during that time frame, what it was lacking, and I didn't really think about this much until afterwards, obviously. Um, but what it was lacking was more about the incident itself. In the rescue, there was obviously a small area where they had a lifeboat that you could sit in, and a small placard that talks about the Carpathia. And the Carpathia is the boat that did rescue those, the ship, excuse me, that did rescue those from the sinking of the Titanic, but doesn't mention the California, which was the closer ship and is said to have actually seen the flares from the Titanic. They saw them and they did nothing. They assumed that the flares were just from a party because, you know, the Titanic being as grand. They really don't talk a lot about what happened during the actual sinking, about the ship breaking in two. They don't talk about how there wasn't enough lifeboats. They don't talk a lot about what it was like trying to get on those lifeboats. They don't talk about how steerage passengers were stuck below decks. So while I obviously thoroughly enjoyed the museum, um, and the artifacts that it has and how you really get a feel for what life was like, it really had a gap in really what happened in those couple hours. You know, there are signs everywhere that says the museum is dedicated to the over 2,000 people that were part of this disaster. And it's quite clear that it does focus very heavily on that human aspect. But there's a lot that it doesn't cover or just kind of skims over. And if you didn't know the history already, you wouldn't understand what happened. And there's very little, at all, if anything at all, that talks about life, how life changed because of this disaster. How the laws for lifeboat changed, how you now need to have a lifeboat for every soul on board, the distinction of class, the class system. While obviously classes still exist today, there's no doubt about that, certainly brought to light the arrogance and egotistical nature of first class, and how that really played a role in what life was like, not only on the Titanic, but during that time frame, which is unfortunate because that's part of the story. That's it. Thanks for traveling along with me. I always appreciate having you on the road. Be sure to check out all my other videos, and I will see you next Tuesday.